Hi there, I'm Sia Shiano. I recently got my master's in classical antiquity from the University of Colorado Boulder, and this is Persephone Reclaimed, Assessing Romantic Retellings of the Rape of Persephone, and content warning for discussions of rape and sexual assault. So, the myth of Persephone can teach us many things about ancient religion and culture, but it is particularly useful in studying the subjugation of women in patriarchal Greco-Roman society. After all, it is a myth that conveys that the male domination of female deities through force or deception is ultimately condoned, and that women are powerless to avoid sexual assault or receive justice after an assault has taken place. To quickly summarize, Persephone, daughter of the harvest goddess Demeter, is kidnapped by Hades, king of the underworld, and forced to become his wife, as shown in this wall painting from Vergina. In her grief, Demeter lets the earth go barren until Zeus, king of the gods, who initially approved of the marriage of Hades and Persephone, allows Persephone to return to her mother. However, because Persephone ate some pomegranate seeds while in the underworld, she is bound to return to Hades for part of every year. For the purposes of this talk, the main sources for this myth are the Homeric hymn to Demeter and Ovid's Metamorphoses. Although neither of these sources contain scenes of explicit sexual assault, we should still interpret these ancient iterations as rape myths. Persephone is shown to be an unwilling partner to Hades, as these excerpts from the Homeric hymn demonstrate. So it says, against her will and on his golden chariot, he carried her off wailing. She is described as his shy wife, very reluctant and longing for her mother. And Persephone herself says, though I was unwilling, he made me eat the pomegranate by force. So it's here implied that Hades forcibly consummates their marriage through sexual intercourse with the metaphor of the pomegranate, a womb-like fruit filled with many seeds. As to how Persephone feels about her circumstances, both the hymn and Ovid make it clear that Persephone only rejoices when she is reunited with her mother. So Ovid says she changed her mind then and changed her expression to match it, and now her fair face, which even Dis found depressing, beams as the sun does. So, given this ancient premise, it is surprising that this rape myth has found such a vibrant second life in modern pop culture as a love story. Many modern authors and artists have taken to altering the myth's plot and reimagining the characterizations of Hades and Persephone in order to portray them as unlikely friends or star-crossed lovers. While these adaptations are not limited to children's media, many of them are intended for younger audiences, from children to teenagers to young adults. In this talk, I'll be focusing on three representative adaptations: Rick Riordan's short story Persephone Marries Her Stalker, the Mythic Warriors cartoon episode Persephone and the Winter Seeds, and Rachel Smythe's webcomic Lore Olympus. In each of these adaptations, the creators do not simply ensure that Hades does not rape Persephone, but they also emphasize Persephone's agency and focus the story from her perspective rather than Demeter's. One could argue that these changes are merely in the service of making this myth child-friendly. However, this myth can be censored without rewriting it as a love story. Hades does not need to be rehabilitated, and Persephone does not need to be happy for this story to still be considered appropriate for young audiences. Now, in the past, I interpreted these changes as feminist reclamations of Persephone and her mythos. My reasoning was that, if a story contains a strong female character in an equal relationship with a male partner, is that story not representing a feminist ideal? While this may be true in isolation, I now feel that there are other factors which must be considered before labeling any of these adaptations as feminist. One of those factors is the role that this myth and its reception play in perpetuating or challenging rape culture. So, as Nikki Phillips documents in Beyond Blurred Lines, Rape Culture in Popular Media, rape culture is a concept that is highly contested and difficult to define in some, because, well, rape itself is highly contested and difficult to define in some. But it can be understood as any culture where rape or sexual assault is normalized to a certain degree. I consider any kind of cultural expression, such as literature, visual media, folklore, etc., which normalizes non-consensual relationships or implicitly condones sexual violence, as evidence of rape culture. I want to draw attention to the importance of framing here. The simple existence of rape in forms of cultural expression does not indicate that a culture is a rape culture. But if the act of rape is framed as normal, such as if those in positions of power allow a rape to go unchallenged, if justice is not sought for the victim, or if the victim is blamed for their own assault, then that is evidence of rape culture. I believe that the myth of Persephone is evidence that Greco-Roman culture was a rape culture, partly because Zeus and Hades condone violence against women, but also because Persephone's marriage to her rapist is ultimately portrayed as a compromise and not a terrible injustice. So when we see this myth being retold in today's pop culture, especially in pop culture aimed at children, we should be thinking about what role it plays in perpetuating rape culture here in 21st century America. Phillips draws attention to how popular culture can propagate rape culture, how it's part of our social fabric as a cluster of images and representations that shape and influence our understandings of sexual violence, and how this can manifest as reproducing rape myths, objectifying women, celebrating male aggression, conflating sexuality and violence, and much more. Challenging rape culture can be a form of feminist resistance to sexual oppression, but not all feminists approach this in the same way. I also want to point out that just because an adaptation removes the act of rape from the myth of Persephone does not mean that it's not still liable to perpetuate rape culture in the way it justifies other non-consensual aspects of Hades and Persephone's relationship. I'll address these concerns further, but for now, let's take a look at each work of perception. So, following the success of his book series about Greek and Roman demigods in the 21st century, Rick Riordan published Percy Jackson's Greek Gods in 2014. This anthology of myths contains the short story Persephone Marries Her Stalker. This story maintains most of the plot elements found in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, but invents scenes such as Zeus advising his lonely and lovesick brother, Hades, to kidnap the naive Persephone. After the abduction has taken place, Hades tries to win Persephone over with apologies and compliments and gifts and promises that he will be a great husband. At first, Persephone is unmoved by his advances, and she throws what are described as epic tantrums, but she eventually feels conflicted and even touched by Hades' devotion. Eating the pomegranate is portrayed as a careless mistake, and Persephone is not distraught by the outcome. By the end of the story, the narrator states the whole experience kind of forced Persephone to grow up. She fell in love with Hades and made a place for herself in the underworld. Overall, the greatest difference between Riordan's story and the myth of Persephone from ancient sources is the characterization of each god. Riordan's Persephone is described as an assertive but spoiled, sheltered, and overprivileged kid, and Demeter's protectiveness is blamed for making Persephone self-centered. Meanwhile, Hades is characterized as the world's first stalker, lonely, obsessive, and desperate for Persephone's affection. This desperation makes Hades seem less aggressive than his ancient counterpart, and the situation as a whole feels less dangerous because Persephone reacts with irritation, not terror, at her captivity. Riordan also attempts to paint Hades as a more sympathetic character by blaming the abduction on Zeus and his bad advice. It seems that Riordan changes the myth in these ways to make the marital relationship between Hades and Persephone seem less reprehensible. Riordan makes no explicit references to sexual assault, nor does he hint at such through symbolism or subtext. He also tries to even out the power dynamic between Hades and Persephone by making Hades remorseful and desperate to please Persephone. In the process, however, Persephone is represented in an unsympathetic manner, which trivializes the severity of her treatment and portrays the abduction as an ultimately positive experience, which leads her to mature. Through asides by the narrator, Riordan does state that kidnapping is wrong and men should not force their affection on women, but the overall message is that women should be sympathetic to these men regardless of how unwanted that affection is. So, Riordan's adaptation is representative of a trend in many retellings of the myth of Persephone, where the creator will try to maintain the same essential plot as the ancient versions, but also rehabilitate Hades and achieve narrative closure through Persephone's eventual love for her husband. It could be argued that this version is at least more feminist than its ancient counterparts because it focuses more on Persephone's experiences in the underworld, and it shows her expressing her agency in whatever way she can. However, Riordan ultimately perpetuates rape culture by downplaying Hades' culpability and by implicitly condoning the abduction since it helped the self-centered Persephone mature. Now, in contrast, an episode of the Mythic Warriors Guardians of the Legend cartoon titled Persephone and the Winter Seeds both reimagines the characterization of Hades and Persephone and radically departs from the plot of the ancient myth. In this cartoon, Persephone runs away from her overprotective mother and accidentally meets Hades, who tells her of his loneliness in the underworld. Persephone takes pity on Hades and offers to befriend him, vowing, "I'll stay with you for a while and we will laugh and dance and become great friends." This idealistic Persephone willingly goes to the underworld, and while the pair experience some romantic moments, Hades never pressures Persephone into marriage, let alone a sexual relationship. Hades even tries to prevent Persephone from being trapped in the underworld after she eats the pomegranate. He respects Persephone's longing to return to her mother and helps bring her back to the world above completely of his own volition. Persephone and Demeter reconcile after Demeter swears to respect her daughter's independence, and Persephone happily agrees to stay with Hades for part of every year. Now, in this cartoon, Persephone is characterized as adventurous and reckless, but not spoiled or selfish. Demeter's controlling nature is ultimately what drives Persephone to leave, but it's clear that both mother and daughter deeply care for each other, and they're able to reconcile their differences. Hades is portrayed as lonely, awkward, and passive. It's Persephone who initiates their relationship, and it's she who also dictates the pace at which they grow closer. Despite his status as king of the underworld, there's no power imbalance between Hades and Persephone, and they both mutually consent to their relationship. I chose this cartoon not because it's particularly popular, but because it is representative of the kinds of retellings where not only is there no act of rape or kidnapping, but Persephone actually chooses to go to the underworld. Because this cartoon does not justify male aggression, and it depicts a female character who exercises her own agency, it's fair to say that this adaptation does not reinforce rape culture. However, given the greater context for the myth of Persephone, can this type of retelling really be called feminist? I certainly used to think so. When I first researched this topic for my undergraduate thesis, I took the stance that works of reception to the myth of Persephone, which eliminated sexual assault and reframed Hades and Persephone's relationship as consensual and romantic, were acts of feminist reclamation which should be celebrated for making classic mythology more welcoming to young women. I thought that eliminating the act of rape from the myth was the only way to truly challenge the sexist rape culture which it represented. But then I read an article published in Eidolon which made me realize that my understanding of this issue was impacted by the limitations of the feminist theory which I had engaged with up to that point. In Rape or Romance, Bad Feminism in Mythic Retellings, Amy Hines discusses the pitfalls of works of reception which unvictimize Persephone, and other liminal women in classical mythology, by removing rape and abduction from their myths. She argues, restoring agency to these women doesn't happen by denying them their trauma, or by removing the label of victim. They enjoy true agency when their authors allow them to rise above their victimhood and become survivors, or at the very least women who deal with the world on their own terms. True feminist retellings recognize and don't repress their characters' liminality. In this article, Hines draws attention to the fact that unvictimizing Persephone does not make her an empowered woman, nor does it truly challenge ancient or modern rape culture. After all, how can it be said that a story actually condemns rape and the cultures that normalize it, when the story acts as if rape and rape culture do not exist? Back in undergrad, when I argued that unvictimizing was actually reclaiming Persephone, I didn't stop to consider, reclaim for whom? Who gets to claim ownership over Persephone, and whose stories are told through her myth? The reality of unvictimizing Persephone is that it forecloses Persephone from existing as a rape survivor. So it certainly seems like Persephone is not being reclaimed for the many women in this world who are survivors of sexual assault and other forms of violence such as abduction, and it's not their stories which are being told. Importantly, in this article, Hines associates adaptations which unvictimize Persephone with white feminism, and instead calls for a more conscious engagement with intersectional feminism in order to center the voices of survivors of sexual assault. To fully understand the different aims and consequences of White's intersectional feminism, it's generative to turn to Bell Hook's seminal text, Feminist Theory from Margin to Center. Hooks contributed to the development of intersectional theory by pointing to how sexism, racism, classism, and other systems of oppression are inextricably entwined, aka they intersect, and how much of mainstream feminist theory emerged from privileged women who live at the center, whose perspectives on reality rarely include knowledge and awareness of the lives of women and men who live in the margin. Historically, the center includes heterosexual, cisgender, non-working class white women, thus the term white feminism, while women of all other identities are pushed to the margins. Hooks identifies how the feminist praxis of these privileged women is often motivated by a desire for social equality with men of their class, in other words, ruling class white men, and how this kind of liberation necessitates the continued exploitation and oppression of others. In response to these facets of white feminism, Hooks argues for a definition of feminism as the struggle to end sexist oppression. And since sexism is inextricably tied to all other systems of oppression, a feminist must also struggle to eradicate the ideology of domination that underpins all of these systems of oppression. So, associating works of reception which unvictimize Persephone with white feminism highlights how these works decenter the experiences of survivors of sexual assault, who are often already marginalized in society through slut shaming, victim blaming, gaslighting, etc. It also draws attention to the fact that unvictimizing Persephone is just one way of making Persephone the social equal of Hades. Hades, as a major deity and ruler of the underworld, is implicitly part of a system of coercive domination over other gods and mortals. Rather than challenge the structures of power that allowed Hades to abduct Persephone, structures that created this myth in the first place, these unvictimizing narratives simply fold Persephone into these structures by making her queen of the underworld. In fact, some modern adaptations really lean in to this idea of Persephone as queen. They tend to emphasize Persephone's minimal influence as the goddess of spring, as well as her desire to escape the controlling and overprotective Demeter. In these adaptations, Persephone often embraces her newfound power as queen of the underworld, literally not unlike a godly girl boss. So, needless to say, a story that depicts a relatively privileged woman getting installed near the top of a patriarchal hierarchy is not doing the work of ending sexist oppression or the ideology of domination. So I now want to introduce Rachel Smythe's webcomic Lore Olympus. This is a rather unusual adaptation that not only changes the plot and characterizations of the ancient myth, but also the setting altogether. In Lore Olympus, the young and naive Persephone is raised on Earth by Demeter, but goes to college on Olympus, which resembles a very modern metropolis. Through the machinations of Aphrodite, Hades, who's more like the CEO of the underworld rather than the king, accidentally takes home a very intoxicated Persephone from a nightclub. While Hades and Persephone are strongly attracted to each other, they do not rush into a sexual relationship, and Hades does not rape Persephone. However, Persephone is still a victim of sexual assault in this webcomic, but the rapist is Apollo, not Hades. So I do want to give Smythe credit for not unvictimizing Persephone, and for centering her experiences as a survivor. I believe that this narrative does challenge rather than simply disregard rape culture by critiquing the attitude of male entitlement that drives Apollo to rape Persephone, while also allowing Persephone to exercise her agency when dealing with the situation to the best of her ability. At the same time, however, Hades is shown to operate at the top of a hierarchy based off the coercive domination of minor divinities and mortals, and Persephone is very much complicit in this system of power. For example, at one point, a reporter publishes a paparazzi photo of Hades and Persephone together. In revenge for this violation of privacy, Hades breaks the reporter's legs, blinds him in one eye, and puts him in the hospital. When Persephone finds out, she expresses more concern over the risk this poses to her reputation than to the health and safety of the reporter, and the entire incident is framed by the story as an opportunity for Hades and Persephone to improve their communication skills. Now, although Persephone does insist that Hades heal the reporter, the physical and psychological damage had already been inflicted, and it's disturbing that Persephone is not more concerned about Hades' obscenely violent reaction. This is one of the reasons why Lore Olympus's characterization of Persephone seems to be animated by the white feminist impulse to assimilate Persephone into the ruling class without any consideration for the lives of other oppressed women and men. So, to recap these three representative retellings of the myth of Persephone, there's Rick Riordan's straightforward adaptation, which inadvertently perpetuates rape culture by trivializing the non-consensual and coercive aspects of Hades and Persephone's relationship. Then there's the Mythic Warriors episode, which presents a consensual romantic relationship, but ultimately does not challenge rape culture so much as disregard it. Finally, the Lore Olympus webcomic still portrays Persephone as a survivor of sexual assault, but also assimilates her into the patriarchal hierarchies of the underworld. Ultimately, none of these romantic retellings offers any kind of coherent critique of the gendered systems of power which allowed mythological women like Persephone to be raped and otherwise subjugated in ancient myth. Though I think it's fair to say that these adaptations are motivated by some feminist impulses, it's important to clarify that this is often demonstrative of white feminism rather than intersectional feminism. And while I understand that these creators want to give Persephone a happily ever after, especially in media aimed at young audiences, I believe that we should be wary of adaptations which implicitly foreclose survivors of sexual assault and other forms of violence from receiving those happy endings. In the future, I hope to see more retellings of this myth which imagined a kind of liberation for Persephone which exists beyond the scope of marriage into a patriarchal hierarchy. Thank you.